It's funded and organized by Tracy Kohlmoos from Public Health. And so the topic of this meeting is going to be the integration between pharmacology and public health as we become more concerned in evaluating the safety of the drug supply chain. And for this meeting, we have two outstanding speakers scheduled for you. The first is Victor Suarez, who has had an illustrious career in the military for 30 years and has served as the lead vaccine program manager for the development of Moderna vaccine during the COVID years, and also has 3 decades of experience in worldwide operational healthcare supply chain acquisition and product development in the military. Joining him is David Light, who is the president of Valisure, who had a brilliant idea a number of years ago that the generic supply chain may need to have independent verification for quality in order to ensure the health of patients that are undergoing medical treatment. And he founded a company, Valisure, that made a prominent note by finding and identifying impurities in ranitidine, trade name Zantac, and that resulted in Zantac being withdrawn from the market and made the news just this week with a very prominent legal settlement. An example of what could happen when there's proper examination and monitoring of generic pharmaceuticals for impurities and safeguarding the supply chain. This is something that Valisure is dedicated to, and we really appreciate working with him. This collaboration also involves the Department of Pharmacology, Department of Internal Medicine, Department of Public Health at USU. We're very happy then to have these speakers, and I'm glad to hand it off to them. You know, the title of their talk is DoD-led Pharmaceutical Quality Assessment, Pilot Study Results and Applications for Health Systems. We look forward to your talk, gentlemen.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Lucky, and also Dr. Irnansky at the Pharmacology Department at the Uniformed Services University. Both Dave and I are very honored to be able to speak to not only this seminar series, but also the Faculty Data Club today, and a host of distinguished guests that have joined the call. And so let's get into it. So we are here today because we recognize that there are a number of people that may not be informed about this particular study, but even just that there is a change in the supply chain, the pharmaceutical supply chain over the last several decades that most Americans are not even aware of. We've recognized as we've traveled the country that a good number of even clinical experts, whether they're pharmacists or physicians, are not even aware of some of the underlying movements in the drug industry and the supply chain over the last several decades. So today what we wanted to do, if you can go to the next slide, Dave, is we can go over an agenda that gives a background on the history, some of the primary issues and the root causes of some of the drug shortages and quality issues what we're seeing now, introduce you to this landmark Defense Department study to further investigate this issue. And secondly, or third, we want to introduce the topic of independent testing as an option. Looks like we have somebody raising their hands about volume. I just want to do a volume check. Can people hear me? Okay. So we're going to introduce independent testing and what that really means in the modern days. We're going to go over some initial results from the first year study of some of the medicines that are emerging. And Dave's going to talk a little bit more about where that connects to potential healthcare outcomes and some of the research that has been going on for several years in the United States with clinical researchers. And then what does this really mean for large health systems that want to not only achieve their cost objectives, but also their quality patient outcome objectives. Next slide. In order to really get a better idea of where we came from to today, I want to make sure we can just go over a quick industry milestones timeline. So in 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 was passed, and it was also known as Dr. Wiley's Law. He was a chemist who really was advocating for concerns that we were seeing in the marketplace in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, where the food industry and an emerging pharmaceutical industry, very emerging at the time, had a lot of problems with adulterated food and medicines, and often were misbranding a lot of the food and the drug supply chain. And so he advocated for a law that was passed in Congress that did a better job of actually, controlling, enabling the United States to better make sure these businesses that were selling foods and medicines, to prevent them from actually saying something else than what they actually were. And so this was a kind of a landmark case here that eventually, 30 years later, led to the 1938 landmark Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act of 1938. You can build that slide, Dave. And what this law did, because the first law didn't really force companies to demonstrate safety and efficacy. They could still market some things that they were claiming in their products. This law tightened that up and really led to the modern day foundation of the Food and Drug Administration. And this really changed things, because now organizations had to not only show that their drugs were safe and effective, but they actually had to demonstrate that with rigorous data. As we get into 1943, we saw that really the pharmaceutical industry really emerge and grow, really in the demands of World War II and the need for antibiotics and some other critical medicines. And really the industry just grew tremendously over the war. And that's where we saw a lot of companies grow from small mom and pop pharmacies to large pharmaceutical companies over just several years. As we get into the later years, as we get into like 1945 to 1962, what we saw was all these emerging domestic and European companies grow quite a bit and make high quality medicines. We saw that at the time, as we got into like the late 50s and early 60s, it was very routine for the regulatory agencies to test thousands and thousands of drugs to see if they were safe for patients. And what they saw was that they weren't seeing too many problems. The pharmaceutical industry was doing a really good job at the time of making high quality medicines. There was a lot of oversight and controls that were put in place into these facilities in the United States and even the European manufacturers. And so they just didn't see the value in testing products at scale in a surveillance program, and they shifted to more for-cause testing with the introduction of current good manufacturing practices. And that really was instituted in the 60s with some updated legislation in 1962 that really changed the dynamic of, okay, the industry is doing a good job. We can trust them to self-regulate, and we're going to set up a framework called GMP, or good manufacturing practice, that is a very rigorous process, but it really relies on very ethical companies to record all their actions and make sure that any of their findings are they do a root cause analysis, what they call a corrective action, preventive action, and then they report those findings to the FDA that they've corrected them and that their products are safe for use. And that was really what was implemented in the 60s. You fast forward to 1984, and what you saw was a major change that occurred in legislation, because in the 70s and then the early 80s, one of the concerns was the rising costs of pharmaceuticals, because they were primarily branded pharmaceuticals, was really taking up such a large proportion of the healthcare spend in the country. And people were concerned that the market was primarily managed by brand name pharmaceutical companies with very, very little options for generics to enter the space at this point. And as a result, there was really a broker deal that split the market in two and created really high value end innovative medicine market with the brand name medicines on one side, and on the other side, a new market emerged with an abbreviated pathway to create generic medicines through a process called an abbreviated new drug application, or ANDA. And that really set the stage for some things to happen, because during that time frame in the 80s and 90s, we started seeing globalization in the markets. Consulting firms were telling manufacturers, United States and Europe, to switch manufacturing capabilities from domestic plants to overseas, where the costs of goods sold could be lowered. You had unlimited access to cheap labor, and you didn't have very strict or at all environmental regulations. If you go to 2001, what we saw was another change significantly from a global trade standpoint. And this is where the World Trade Organization in the United States was a voting member to this, voted to support China as a favored nation's trading status partner. And what this did was it really boosted China's ability to open up global markets and really invest in their manufacturing capabilities. And they often went for some of the low value technologies at first, and they went after the supply chain, and in multiple sectors. And really where they put a foothold in it was a lot of the things that we weren't willing to do in the United States or in Europe because of environmental reasons. And a lot of that was just making chemicals. And so that allowed China to really open up their manufacturing markets, because now they could sell to all over the world, to include the United States, at great scale. If you fast forward it to 2009, what we saw was, a concern over a major problem that happened in China with an adulterated medicine. It was the scandal with some active ingredients in a blood thinner medicine that led to a major story in the United States and the deaths of several dozens of people, potentially even hundreds. And the Government Accountability Office designated, the FDA's oversight of overseas manufacturers as high risk after this big scandal in 2008 with a very reputable U.S. company that was importing active ingredients for this blood thinner into the United States. And what they found was that there wasn't really much of a presence for U.S. regulatory oversight in mainland China over this. So that became a concern since 2009. And as we go into 2010 to 19, we started to see very, large increases in drug shortages in a marketplace that had shifted most of their manufacturing for upstream materials, whether that's active pharmaceutical ingredients, key starting materials, and even finished product, to places where it was cheaper to make the manufacturing. And what we saw was a consolidation of the market as well, because you had some nations like China that were they were subsidizing their manufacturing industry, and they were targeting specifically domestic and other Western manufacturers, and really lowering the cost of those medicines to the point where Western companies could not compete because they weren't able to sacrifice their quality or their manufacturing capabilities in the United States or in Europe. And as you saw this happening, a lot of these companies in the United States and in Europe stopped making those lines, and a lot of those lines, those NDCs and those manufacturing lines, shifted to places like India and China. And they started to taking really a concentrated marketplace where now maybe only a handful of companies were making a critical essential medicine like an antibiotic. And what that does is it leads to a fragility in the supply chain when you overly concentrate the marketplace. And what happens is, if you sacrifice quality and get caught during an investigation from a regulatory authority, you may have to shut down. And so when you concentrate it down to maybe 2 or 3 manufacturers, what ends up happening when you get caught with a quality problem is you have to shut down and do root cause analysis and a corrective action. And that now then takes out that critical supply of the marketplace, thus leading to all-time shortages. If you fast forward to 2020, this pandemic really exposed that supply chain vulnerability and the lack of resiliency. And now what we have over the last several years, and it just peaked this past spring, is all-time high drug shortages. And that's now exceeding 320 as of this past spring. Dave, if you can go to the next slide, please. And this build right here shows you kind of a highlight. 13% of the marketplace in 1984, prior to Hatch-Waxman, was the generic market space. Now generics make up 91% of the U.S. prescriptions. That is 91% of the market is really for prescription medicines. And one of the things I want to emphasize is that we are not here to bash on generic medicines. As a matter of fact, the overwhelming majority of medicines that you'll see in the data are actually high quality and are good medicines. What we are going to try to highlight here and help people bring to the attention is that there are a certain number of percentage of medicines that are out there that are high risk, and we're not making a regulatory judgment. We're actually just doing some chemical analysis, and we're scoring those medicines in a rubric that was published in a pharmaceutical or a pharmacy journal back in 2022. So with this growing concern with drug quality, it's gotten the attention of major media. Bloomberg Business Week has reported on this extensively through their Bad Medicines award-winning journalism series since the last 5 or 6 years. The New York Times has reported on this multiple times over the last several years. We have think tanks like the Milken Institute Review that's questioning whether or not we're doing a good job with, regulatory oversight, or at least the marketplace overseeing the quality of these medicines. And the Wall Street Journal even saying, look, these drug shortages are stemming from quality problems in Indian factories. And so this is becoming more mainstream over the last several years as some examples. Next slide. And so our drug supply chain is in a crisis mode at this point, evidenced by overwhelming drug shortages and also really a marketplace problem. So if you look here on the left, we have over 300 drug shortages, the supermajority due to quality problems and the concentration of the market, as I mentioned, and really an overemphasis on lowest cost with really very little focus on quality and other measures of resiliency in that supply chain. We have approximately 3 recalls a day at very serious issues. For those people that get those alerts, it really happens every day all over the world. And that hurts public health, and it costs billions and billions of dollars into our health system. And as I mentioned before, a growing number of medicines, not only the finished doses, but also the key starting materials and the active pharmaceutical ingredients are made more and more in places like India and China, where they're susceptible to geopolitical risk. There's a national security component, and that's one of the reasons why the Defense Department is very concerned about this. And both those countries, even though India is an ally of the United States, neither of those countries actually meet the standard to be a trade agreement act compliant nation to sell finished products to U.S. federal health systems, to include VA or the DoD. So that's just another thing to keep in consideration with our drug supply chain. Another thing we wanted to kind of introduce to you is this, this notion that shift of quality is really now based since the 60s on GMP. And that's really based on self-reported data, the trust of the manufacturers to kind of self-report, self-police themselves, and then report that to the regulatory agency. And what we're not saying here is we're not questioning the approval rigor of the Food and Drug Administration or the other regulatory agencies. For the new drug approvals, it's a very, very rigorous standard. Sometimes takes $1 billion and over a dozen years to get a new drug to the marketplace. And it's very, very rigorous. But if you look at the generic drug approval pathway that was set in law in 1984, it's a completely abbreviated pathway where the clinical trial population from a commercial research organization may only have 24 to 36 people to show or demonstrate bioequivalence of that new molecule generic medicine to the brand name drug, and can get a product to the marketplace in about 2 years or so. And so that difference in the thresholds of rigor of approval, and as well as what you have in there is barrier to entry, opens it really wide for a variety of companies from all over the world to enter the market space to get a generic drug approved, versus the top line, which is really reserved for those multi-billion-dollar commercial companies that have deep R&D budgets and the ability to investigate new technology. And what we see here is that even though the regulatory agency is the gold standard for this drug approval, that doesn't necessarily equate to what happens after that product is commercialized. And this is where I'm talking about quality and safety monitoring. With the growing number of these essential medicines that are made overseas, we see that we have to rely on an honor system of these manufacturers using GMP to go ahead and self-report that to the regulatory agency. And if you follow the news at all, there's clearly cases regularly. I mean, even today, if you look at some of the alerts on the FDA's findings in their investigation, they're finding more and more of some of these overseas manufacturers that are falsifying data and not telling the truth to the regulatory agencies. And then it's exacerbated by a huge backlog that not only started prior to the pandemic, but was exacerbated by the pandemic, where the regulatory agencies worldwide have thousands and thousands of backlogs. One news report of almost 2,000 just for the FDA alone of some of these plants, both in the United States and abroad, where they haven't been able to get in these plants, mainly because of the pandemic exacerbating that. But also, it's very, very difficult to get approval to do inspections no notice in any of these countries like India and China, where you have to get approval and often notice of about 6 to 8 weeks in advance. Whereas that's not really the case in the United States or in Europe, where the regulatory agencies can come in same day and no notice. So what we want to, highlight here is that, the process is the process. This is the regulatory process, and it really relies on ethical companies doing the right thing. And what we're kind of introducing here is how independent quality data is complementary to the regulatory efforts, right? It's another tool in the toolbox to deal with the realities of a globalized marketplace. Next slide. And this isn't a novel idea in the United States. As a matter of fact, the Europeans have done this for over a decade with their European OMCLs, or their official medicines control labs. These laboratories are accredited under the ISO 17025, the same accreditation that Dave Light's company Valisure is accredited under. And one thing that's unique about an ISO accredited chemical analysis lab is that they work independently. The fourth pillar in ISO is impartiality. And by highlighting this, you can test medicines independently of manufacturers, that is, without conflicts of interest and with guaranteed impartiality. The OMCLs have a fundamental role in ensuring quality, safety, and efficacy of medicines. And this is something the Europeans have done. They have several dozens of these, and they work hand in hand with the European Medicines Agency. They work closely with Interpol to prevent more counterfeit medicines entering into the supply chain in Europe. And they're not only there to protect human health, but also animal health as well, with a lot of the fraudulent, counterfeit, or adulterated medicines trying to enter into the European supply chain. Next slide. And so the next thing is I want to introduce this concept of a three-legged stool, and where currently what we have right now is we have manufacturers GMP. Again, I emphasize this relies heavily on ethical companies, most of which are doing the right thing every day. And those that have entered the market that don't believe in doing the right thing all the time. Then you have the regulators, okay? You have the FDA, EMA, and some of their partners that help regulate the supply chain. And then the third thing I want to introduce, in order to balance that stool, to make it stable, resilient, and something that could be trusted to uphold the entire health system, is independent review. And this is an area where I think you can conceptualize that stool is really out of balance when you just have the manufacturers and the regulators. But if you have now a third-party independent review of the medicine, now you have an opportunity to be a consumer advocate, not only for patients, but also for health systems that are concerned about meeting their quality objectives and making sure that they can procure medicines at best value, not just simply the lowest cost. Next slide. And there's been a big, broad call to action for transparency, for quality. As a matter of fact, in 2022, HHS ASPR published a report called Report Essential Medicines and Manufacturing Resilience Assessment. And they talked about recommendations such as leveraging the government's collective buying power to reform procurement protocols, revising purchasing models to increase emphasis on product quality and supply chain resilience, not simply lowest costs. We also see bipartisan movement on the Hill through an NDAA. And we see think tanks like the Brookings Institute that recommend selecting vendors that are less likely to experience production disruptions and recommending FDA and other parties to provide information about manufacturer quality and reliability, which the FDA is working on. And also news outlets like Bloomberg publish, recommending publishing quality metrics to better help producers better producers would be rewarded and standards would rise. There would be fewer lapses to discover, hence fewer interruptions in supply. Next slide. So this is where that bipartisan Congress really got into the mix in 2022 as we were coming out of the pandemic. And they filed in the FY23 National Defense Authorization Act, Section 860. Among many things, they required the DoD to establish a working group to assess risk to the department's pharmaceutical supply chain. And this was done not only because of a concern about that supply chain and its shortages, but also the fact that there was concern on the Hill that we had such an over-reliance on supply chains that came from overseas, often from adversarial nations to the United States. And this working group then divided into two investigations. One was a logistical origins risk, mapping that supply chain and the products that come into that supply chain. And that's led by the Defense Logistics Agency in their logistics supply chain risk assessment that was reported out in November of 2023. The next one is the quality risk investigation, and that's now led by the Uniformed Services University with a focus on independent testing, quality scoring of operational medicines critical for warfighting efforts. Next slide. And so this is a 2-year project at the Uniformed Services University led by the principal investigator, Tracy Colmus, who's traveling right now overseas, but she'll be back soon. Next slide. And this project overview of this study, or otherwise known as FACTS, is a multi-line effort of study. It's not just about testing the medicines. It's a very comprehensive study with 6 lines of efforts. And the results of the study are anticipated to inform policy making regarding sourcing and distribution of high-quality essential drug products for both the military health system and for the nation. And so you can get a taste of the lines of effort here that's very comprehensive in a risk assessment, analyzing the drug manufacturing capability domestically, examining the drug supply chain, an acceptability study for a large health system such as the military health system, comparison of various essential medicine lists that exist out there. And then finally, what we're going to talk a little bit about today with Dave is line of effort 6, the evaluation of the drug products itself. Next slide. And so this is what it looks like. We have layers of defense kind of in this evaluation where there's some primary testing here by the primary lab. We've set up a network of both academic and commercial labs for secondary testing of if the primary lab finds a drug is high risk, therefore a red listed drug, it's then secondarily tested in another lab in a blinded way so that we can either confirm or deny that drug is a high risk. There's a level of independent scoring with a separate expert review panel, and those scores are associated with a relevant national drug code, so you can make decisions on your formulary, not only just considering price, but also risk of the drug and certain quality metrics that Dave's going to talk about in just a bit. Next slide. And again, just to emphasize how much attention this has in a bipartisan Congress, back in 30 April of this year, 6 of us were called to testify in the Senate Armed Services Committee, Subcommittee on Personnel, on this particular study. And so this was a great opportunity for us to communicate to policymakers in the Senate about the importance of this study and the impacts that it can have to improve the military health system and potentially the health system of the United States if we start to look at the benefits of independent review of the quality of our medicines. Next slide. And even right now, we have pending legislation for the Veterans Administration. And so one of the potential language in that is that drug quality scoring is recommended by the department to the VA to partner with the Uniformed Services University to evaluate, the benefits of what they're learning there, and to potentially see what that could do for the VA system beyond just the DoD. So this time, I'm going to pass the presentation over to Dave Light, and he is going to really dive into what is independent testing and some of the data and some of the findings that we've had to date. Dave?
Thanks very much, Vic. I think that was an amazing background, and thank you to Uniformed Services University and Dr. Lucky for the opportunity to present on this. It's certainly a high-impact topic, and I think one of the questions that we get a lot is, what do we mean by independent testing? What is that? And as Vic alluded to with the European model, we have very much the same definition, that it's still an accredited system. It's accredited to this global standard of ISO 17025, and specifically not GMP, where we're not intending to just replicate what the manufacturers are doing, which actually has a lot of focus on the specific formulation that a specific manufacturer is responsible for. You can imagine you go to the pharmacy to get ibuprofen. You can get Advil, you can get Motrin, you can get a store brand that all have 200 milligrams of ibuprofen. However, they'll have potentially very different GMP systems for the analysis of Advil versus Motrin, and that relates to all the technicalities of their manufacturing plants, of their systems of producing that particular formulation, which also makes it quite expensive. There's a tremendous amount of work that they have to do for the regulatory function of their manufacturing that they need to show to the FDA, that needs to be auditable. And all of that flows into this GMP testing system. Whereas with ISO, it's much more of an independent review, kind of an academic lens on the quality of that product. So it's also much more efficient. We'll have one method for ibuprofen. Obviously, if you're looking at Tylenol or acetaminophen, that would be different. But we look at the Advil and the Motrin in practically the same way. And so that gives us an ability to also measure them against each other, have one target that gets painted and see where the arrows fall in comparison to each other with one methodology, and is also much more efficient. It's much cheaper at the end of the day, and therefore much more realistic to add into the supply chain without adding a tremendous amount of cost or upending the system in any way that we obviously wouldn't want to do. And I think also why the Europeans also leverage this as a spot checking system there. And we really have the opportunity to do much better, since we have a nationalized system of national drug codes in the United States. So that's, and I'll get into that a bit more, but that's kind of the high level on what we mean with truly independent testing that's outside of that framework of what the manufacturers are doing for their manufacturing. And even from a scientific standpoint, this is a slide with a whole bunch of information on it, but really summarizing what we've seen in just a few years of looking at various impurities that have a lot of impact, often result in recalls all over the world. And there's even been a few key carcinogens that have led to a lot of this, the nitrosamines, which is a continued area of focus. And one of them, the simplest version, NDMA, has had a lot of impact. And more recently, benzene is a topic and a contaminant that we've seen in a variety of areas. And although the FDA has obviously shifted to a GMP system where most of the testing is done by the manufacturers, they still have a for-cause on-market system where they have some of the resources to do a few dozen of these products a year, and will often identify the products that have had problems, like Zantac that Dr. Lucky was mentioning in the very beginning was actually flagged. Similar products like nizatidine, metformin, the sartans have been flagged by various quality signals that the FDA has identified. But by doing testing in the GMP box, which is also prescribed by the manufacturer. So they're looking for what they feel are the highest risk items, the highest risk analytes. And a benefit of the independent review is not only looking in that box that is defined as the GMP tests, but also looking outside of that. And obviously, Valisher's found a lot by looking outside of just the GMP box. But others have done it too. It was actually Novartis that originally identified the NDMA in valsartan that started a whole wave of recalls and particular quality issues in a variety of drugs, and motivated Valisher to actually start adopting analysis for nitrosamines in our standard screens for all pharmacy products, allowing us to identify it in a variety of other products. And importantly, there can be a lot of discussion around methodologies, which is appropriate. And there can be different methodologies for GMP versus something more academic, ISO accredited. But at the end of the day, the outcomes are real. There becomes recalls. There's even market withdrawals, like have been more recently talked about with Zantac. And it really has a big impact on the industry, is validated through other regulators all around the world looking into this, the manufacturers themselves, academics that delve into it and publish many papers. We've also published a lot in the peer-reviewed academic sphere, and it's all validation to show that this is really important testing and is very complementary to the whole framework that already exists. And so, speaking of a framework, as Vic had talked about, there was this paper in the Journal of the American Pharmacists Association that prescribed a system for taking a lot of complex data, like all this chemistry data that we're talking about, and boiling it down into a simple but actionable system of red, yellow, green risk scores. So again, these are not necessarily having regulatory implications. Sometimes it could, but really the point is that red is a high risk, as in we have limited data that there are chemical quality issues that could be arising in these products from a particular manufacturer, yellow being medium, green being low. And one of the things that we've also seen multiple times, and the paper itself had this data, and we've looked at this even in some of the Defense Department data, that there just does not appear to be any correlations between the price of these products and their quality. And so I think the important takeaway is that there very often is a lot of green that could be bought at low prices. You don't have to spend a lot more, or perhaps any more at all, to get high quality generics. And just echoing Vic's comments that this isn't at all a push to have people buy brand instead of generics. There's tremendous value that comes out of having the generic drug industry, but we want to reward green and have a market incentive for green. And so to get into a bit of the sausage of how this all comes out, and this is mock data here, but kind of gives you the universe of these various analytical tests in the two buckets of effectiveness and safety. And effectiveness, depending on the products, can be a particular test around dosage or the potency. What is it? It says 200 milligrams, how close to that and how consistent is it? Or dissolution, how a drug actually dissolves. And we'll look at some initial data on that. This can be particularly important for extended release products. And then a whole universe of safety, contaminants, impurities, whether those are carcinogens, heavy metals, cross-contaminants. A lot of concern over that, and a lot of ways to build objective metrics that boil down, according to this paper, into a scoring rubric. And I think important point to note, as Vic had showed in this line of effort 6, is that the data is being generated by Valisher and secondary tested by an entire network of laboratories. But where you draw the line on these rubrics that add up to a final score of the red, yellow, green is being set by clinical and biostatistician co-authors of this study. So they are determining, based on a lot of data and a lot of updates onto the framework that was published, where do the lines get drawn for this whole scoring framework and what constitutes that green, yellow, and red. And not saying that it's perfect, but at least it creates this framework that can be actioned upon. And a really important component of that framework and of that paper is that all these scores are not just tied to a manufacturer's product, but are tied to the national drug codes. So the national drug code system is what is required for any drug to be on the market in the United States. And that is different from Europe, which every country has its own regulatory framework and distribution framework. And so that means that the NDCs that are being scored for the military are the same NDCs that can be bought by Kaiser Permanente or by CVS or are reimbursed for by Medicare and Medicaid or private health insurance plans. The whole pharmaceutical system in the United States is based on these national drug codes. And I think that's what's really important here as well, is not just looking or trying to find maybe a quality management maturity of a particular manufacturer, which could also add value in terms of the transparency of the supply chain. But this is what everybody is actually using. If you're a health system that's purchasing a drug, you're not purchasing from a facility directly, and you're often not even purchasing from a manufacturer. You're purchasing a national drug code. And so to have that aligned with quality transparency that's straightforward, like this red, yellow, green, is really an opportunity to change the system, to have a system where there's transparency and incentive for green, where ideally you'd have low-cost products that you can buy that are green. And so that bringing us back to the actual project, and this is certainly one where we're very open to collaboration. I'll even talk about some of the institutions around the country that have been increasingly engaged. But publishing here, the first 12 of the drugs that were chosen and really represent many different therapeutic classes. So all these drugs that are part of this project are leaning heavily on two major lists that are very important for the military. First and foremost, the DoD effectively an essential medicines list, or the operational medicines list, drugs that have been identified as most critical as a warfighting necessity, and also a deployable checklist. So these are drugs that a service member can be on before they're deployed, but have to show stability. So obviously, instability in such drugs can diminish the deployability of our forces, not to mention have other healthcare implications and outcomes for the entire nation. And so it was really a purposeful exercise of looking at drugs that are obviously very important for the military, but at the same time, very important for the entire nation and represent many of the largest therapeutic classes of drugs, like cardiology medications, blood pressure medications, cholesterol medications, but also diabetes, antibiotics, antidepressants, a whole slew of different products that will start having some actionable quality transparency data for with these risk scores. And to have an example here to just see a little bit of what that looks like. And this is initial data, hasn't gone through all the final secondary testing and so on. And there's more columns that are going to be added. But even from this, you can see that there's certain tests, like, for example, here, carcinogens for this drug metoprolol, very important high blood pressure medication, very important for forward deployment for cardiac arrest, heart attack, but is also the 6th most prescribed drug in the United States for hypertension or high blood pressure. So important on many levels. And we see that they're all quite clean. So all these various generic drug manufacturers and the brand in here, and important point, we're also testing brand, have no quality issues that we're seeing from a purely carcinogen standpoint. There are some signals on heavy metals or toxic elements. But the largest signals that we see in this case is dissolution. So how the drugs are actually coming apart has a lot more of a scoring rubric implication. But again, important to note that even when we look at all these various elements, we're seeing a lot of green. And we very often see this where there's a high amount of green, perhaps some yellow as well, and a few reds that are substantially different than the rest of their competitors. And this is some more granular data to delve into, where we're looking at the dissolution curves here. And again, this is one method that has simulated gastric fluid, simulated intestinal fluid as a universal method to test all. And so it's not the USP regulatory standard that each manufacturer, each generic manufacturer of the same drug gets to set for their specific formulation. And that's fine, again, for GMP. So the USP methods that are registered are very much a good example of GMP, a part of the regulatory system. But to be independently tested, we're looking at one target to paint for all the arrows to be shot at. And you see that there's some substantial difference, even by eye, as you see how the drug dissolves over time, which is what these curves are. And in dark black is the brand. And that's what was originally registered in terms of its therapeutic impact, is this original black line and the brand medication. And then the generics have many that follow very close to this line, and some, even by eye, have a high difference percentage. And that's what's mathematically calculated here, is looking at all the various points and how different they are from the kind of the reference molecule of the brand. And this is an area that is increasingly concerning for a lot of academic research centers and health systems. And there's been quite a growing body of epidemiological evidence and even direct testing evidence of correlating these kinds of potentially effectiveness tests and differences in generics to adverse events. And in certain products like anti-epileptic medications, there's a tremendous amount of data because unfortunately it's very clear if a medication is off. In the case of epilepsy, you could get a breakthrough seizure, which could lead to very high hospitalization rates, much higher rates of head injury or fracture, and are found to be much higher with the generic drug use or generic switching compared to the brand. And we've run a number of models in various therapeutic classes on this with a lot of the published data. And even if we're just focusing on the bottom 10%, the assumption that we could hopefully incentivize the system to green and avoid red and fix red. If the manufacturers have transparent ways of how to turn a red into a green, we can really incentivize the system. But just looking at this bottom 10% is $1 billion problem plus, with thousands of adverse events, heart attacks, strokes, hospitalizations, outpatient visits that could all be correlated to these poorer quality generic drugs that we really should be incentivizing to be better. And some of these studies now have gotten large enough that they're even delving into not just that there's a difference between the brand and the generic as a whole, but that individual manufacturers are performing differently, have different healthcare outcomes depending on the different generic manufacturers. So just as we see there's differences in the chemistry, there's more and more evidence that there's also differences in the outcome. And in this case, looking at different rates of outpatient visits of patients on atorvastatin, original brand name Lipitor, the #1 prescribed drug in the United States. And so there's really that growing body of evidence that we need to do something about this. And we're very honored that we're often involved in a variety of these leading healthcare systems drive to do something, and sometimes directly and sometimes indirectly, just by creating that drive for independent testing and quality assurance. University of Kentucky is an excellent example of a health system that took it upon themselves, have their own laboratory that they do independent testing on drug products that go through their health system. NYU is doing something similar with us externally. So they're sending us products to be independently tested and reviewed when they see issues. And a whole variety of institutions that have been really leaning into researching this. We recently gave a grand round medicine presentation at Stanford University Medicine that's available online, and a lot of concern there in their medical school and even business school on how do we do something about this and research it further. And I think some of the most scalable solutions coming from large healthcare systems like Kaiser Permanente, like the military that's building on this drug quality scoring system, and Kaiser having the contract requirements to essentially stay green and have every batch tested before it arrives in the Kaiser warehouses. And I think, again, this really aligns, and borrowing a slide from a recent FDA presentation, that what this whole system wants is everyone coming away with more confidence in their medications, more confidence in generic drugs. We want to build confidence in generic drugs, get the green to be the prominent manufacturing standard, raise the standards and incentivize those standards is, I think, what really aligns the whole industry. And a little bit about how that functionally works, where the Kaiser, the folks at Kaiser Permanente have been looking at this for years and have essentially built their own kind of red, yellow, green system, looking at all the data available to them, and we're even able to share some of the Defense Department data with them as well, so they can pick a green manufacturer, and they have enough volume that they contract direct with manufacturers, and then require ongoing certification for every batch once they've picked that green supplier. And the DoD is really making that concept universal by saying, even if you don't have all of these systems in place to differentiate red, yellow, green, by attaching these kinds of chemical quality risk scores to the NDCs, any purchaser that's looking at drugs, either direct or indirectly, can now at least have some snapshots of that risk scores, and it could also use it to decide who to contract with, whether it's a GPO, a health system, or an individual pharmacy, all in between. So that's, I think, certainly a way to fix this broken marketplace that many have talked about. This is actually a figure from University of Kentucky's publication, that we have a system that's unfortunately been very focused on cost for the last 40 years during a lot of globalization, and we need to fix it with a higher emphasis on quality to improve resiliency, lower the rate of drug shortage, potentially improve outcomes, and leverage procurement dollars, increase the incentive for quote-unquote green. And just a quote from Senator Crapo at a recent drug shortages Senate hearing is that I think that message is starting to be really received and understood, that we have big problems of not compensating for quality and honestly no transparency to quality. And it's really up to us to start to push for that, have options of deciding which products are green versus red, and really honored that the Defense Department is absolutely leading the way with doing this and making it actionable. We hope there'll be more and more in this space, and would love to have any question. I know we have limited time right now, but I'm sure Vic is available. I'm available as well if you want to email us any thoughts, and just thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much for great talk. So, and I think we use a few minutes for questions. So, so please, if you have any questions, so raise a hand. We have one question in chat. So this is a question from Kristen Herring. Were the recalls that were indicated on the previous slide directly tied on the independent test results, or were the FDA test the cause? This probably slide 16 or 17 regarding.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to comment on that. And I think it's actually a good point that I very often, certainly from the voucher perspective, will publish some data either in an FDA citizen petition or in a peer-reviewed scientific study, and it will get further validated. And there's many instances where FDA itself will follow up on and test some of those products. We've shared products with the FDA on multiple occasions, and we're happy to do that. I think it's an important collaborative capability, and industry too, right? I think very often the FDA will ask manufacturers and actually I think a lot of credit to the FDA after we identified benzene, which there hadn't been a regulatory action on benzene since 1990, when benzene trace levels were found in Perrier water, and it was withdrawn all over the world. So really a new contaminant that within months, the FDA told manufacturers they needed to start testing for benzene. This is an obvious problem. And then certain manufacturers started testing and seeing that our initial results were also found by them as well. Products like hand sanitizers, sunscreens, and others, and led to recalls. So yes, I think the answer is that it is tested by many. I think it's often that independent testing, like at Valisure, may identify that core issue or some of those initial findings, and then hopefully rapidly followed up by regulators and industry to take action.
Thank you. So we also have great comments from John Gray with links, for important links. So, and two other questions. So from Kevin Webb, how has generic industry embraced quality testing? Would US CGMP generic manufacturers see this as a differentiating advantage?
Yeah, I think from what we hear, at least, and I know Vic's had some discussions with folks as well, is that this is a change, right? So not to sugarcoat that not everybody's thrilled about change, period, anytime that the status quo shifts. But I think the generic drug industry is really looking for the ability to incentivize quality at all, or to get credit for the quality that they already invest into their systems, some of them more than others. Right, the FDA has talked for over a decade about ranking manufacturers according to quality management maturity. That's an excellent idea, right? And I think underscores the point that not all manufacturers, as Vic alluded to as well, are treating this the same. You know, whether some are committing complete fraud, which does happen. If you read Catherine Eben's book, Bottle of Lies, you get some very real-world examples of that. But even by accident or just how much investment that they're doing in quality systems, there is a lot of differentiation. So, and I think when you have a price-only system, you have no incentive to be investing in quality. So I think generic drug companies are seeing this more and more as an opportunity to differentiate, to get value for the quality that they invest in. I know Vic wanted to comment as well.
Yeah, so I think I would just put in general, no, I think there's an uncomfortable aspect for generic companies that may not understand this particular study or this approach that Kaiser and the Defense Department has undertaken. So I think initially there's a lot of, hey, this is rocking the boat with what we're used to dealing with. But I will tell you a short story. I was brought into a focus group last year at the White House, and I know Professor Gray is aware of this, and we had somebody that was a representative head of quality of a domestic generics manufacturer that believes that they do high quality manufacturing. They even train FDA investigators at this particular facility. And one of the things that person said was that they said, you know, initially this was something that we are not comfortable with doing. It's definitely outside of our norms. But one of the things that person highlighted was that plant, that business was at 50% manufacturing capability, and that they were basically teetering on the lines of going out of business. And what that person said was, if this could be, whether it's quality maturity manufacturing or quality product testing, being the differentiator that allows them to get more business because they believe they make high quality green products, then that might be the way that they can actually be solvent, that they can get more market share back, right? That could be the differentiator. So that's one little anecdotal feedback that I got in one of those sessions. But I'd like the audience to really think about whether or not the generic industry, embraces this or not. Most of this testing is really due diligence on behalf of health systems that are concerned about delivering quality care and making sure that their purchasing dollars, or if they're a group purchasing organization, it's about them being able to buy best value medicines for their patients and hopefully give their patients a better opportunity of achieving the health outcomes that they deserve as patients. So I think that's another consideration. And quite frankly, if you look in a parallel sector, a completely different sector, but something where the manufacturers resisted independent quality review was in the automobile industry in the 60s and 70s. And it wasn't until independent evaluation and crashworthiness testing of vehicles in the United States was done by the IIHS in the 70s and 80s did we start to see that the manufacturers had to embrace over time safety features in vehicles that they could not, the regulatory agency could not get the automobile manufacturers to do, to include, cross seat belts, radial tires, anti-lock brakes, shatterproof glass, rollover technologies eventually, and now crash collision, anti-crash collision avoidance technologies. Those are all things in the automobile industry over the last several decades that have reduced dramatically road fatalities per 100,000 by 39% in the United States. And it was basically independent testing organizations like IIHS, Consumer Reports, and several other independent testing agencies working with the National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration. And what they did was they partnered with each other, complement each other's data, and influence the marketplace to make safer, more reliable cars for everybody. And I see that as a very strong parallel if you look at the history of the automobile industry in the United States. Back to you.
And maybe sorry to add one really interesting, important point on that question, and also on Vic's examples, is that a key advantage of this drug quality type of transparency and quality metric is that it has no barriers to acquire this, right? We can freely, there's no trade secret, there's no, if you have an independent reviewer, there's no conflict of interest, and we can get those products from off the shelf, right? We can be that secret shopper. We're just getting that product, and therefore able to independently evaluate it and create very simplistic metrics, right? It lends itself to this kind of red, yellow, green concept. There could be a regulatory limit that could be above a red even for lead, but wouldn't you rather incentivize a manufacturer to have 0 nanograms of lead as opposed to 3 nanograms, even if the limit is 5? And again, limits are set as a minimum standard. So pushing beyond that minimum is definitely a way to lower overall risk. If you're at 3, you might accidentally become 6. Much higher risk of doing that from a resiliency standpoint, but also from just a healthcare outcome standpoint, better off with the lower risk green. And I think that's part of what, honestly, Congress is struggling with a little bit right now. And a lot of what do we do about all of these issues is that looking at quality metrics like resilience or location are very complex, are very difficult to get that kind of information. A lot of resilience information relies on the manufacturer reporting. Do they have dual sourced API or not? How much inventory do they have on hand? All these kinds of things are complicated to turn into metrics and very complex to actually get the data. So having data that we can, whether it's embraced by the industry or not, and hopefully it is, it can, and maybe it's just going to take time, but we don't have to wait for that time of complete embracing. We're doing it now, and we're able to do that because of the ability to pull it in and making it actionable and simplistic.
Thank you, Vic and David. So Karen and Harry Lever raise at hand. So can you ask your question?
Yeah, I'm trying here. 1 second.
And we can hear you, Harry.
Okay, all right. The thing I'm really worried about, I've been interested in this problem for a long time, and I've seen patients that when the manufacturers were changed, the patients suddenly didn't do well. And I think we've got to be very careful that pharmacies do not change manufacturers without the physicians knowing about it. That's one problem. The other problem is shipping of drugs has become a problem, and in the heat. And I think that needs to be looked at very carefully. If you're shipping certain drugs, by the mail, they may fail because it's too hot. And I think that has to be very carefully looked at. And I've had a lot of experience with poor drugs, and we've got to, and I really think that all of these drugs need to be tested. All the batches need to be tested so that we know that whatever you're going to swallow is going to work. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Harry. And just to add on to that point, a nuance of this project that we didn't get to discuss, but actually speaks to something that you bring up is where in the supply chain we're even sampling from. And an important point that's baked into the Defense Department project is that it's also independently sourced. So we're not getting these products that are going for scoring direct from a manufacturer. And there's actually examples of this where at the manufacturing plant, perhaps it was a clean product. But and metformin, by the way, was a good example where many, including the FDA, have done a pretty deep root cause analysis. And what happened is that through transportation along the way in the supply chain, will create problems over time, whether it's a heat or just a reaction that's happening slowly over time. And so sampling, at least from the distributors, as we're doing, allows us to bake at least some of that downstream distribution into what we're looking at. So it may have been sitting on the shelves in a distributor in a variety of places around the world before it gets to us. And that kind of independent sourcing, I think, is definitely important and is part of the project.
Thank you, David. We have 6 more questions in chat. So first from Andy Snow. Has your data to date identified repeat offender manufacturers that may produce multiple generic drugs that test yellow or red?
It's a great question. And I think as we create a broader universe of data, we'll hopefully be able to better answer that question. But I think it's also a very tricky question. And actually, the logistics a part of the DoD working group investigation into the whole supply chain recently had the report I think Vic mentioned. And it's very hard to know where things are actually coming from. It's hard enough to know even which manufacturing facility a product is actually made in to try to answer that question, let alone very important materials like the active pharmaceutical ingredient. Getting back to that is even more complex. And I think a lot of the high-level conclusions of the Defense Department's working group, a lot of very smart, motivated people that try to answer these kinds of where are things coming from and how could you group data together, that kind of question. And they were finding, I think it was about a quarter of all the products that are on the essential medicines list, they had no idea. They had no information, and not just limited information, but no information about where these key ingredients were coming from, what the facilities, how the facilities are linked. So I think, that said, I think we will start to have more and more insights. I can tell you that what we've seen from studies as well, and we've published a few studies on drugs like metformin that have very complex contamination issues of various carcinogens, is that you do see quite a bit of difference from manufacturer to manufacturer and even from batch to batch. And I think there might have been a question on that as well, where you could have a certain manufacturer that honestly every single batch that we tested had very high levels of contamination. Let's call it a red. You could have other manufacturers that for a good number of batches that we were able to test were always very clean. Let's call that a green. And you have some where a few batches were heavily contaminated and a few other batches were entirely clean. And we've seen that situation many times with a variety of contaminants and quote unquote dirty manufacturing perhaps results. And that does underscore the batch to batch nature that is important. And it can be hard to address, and this quality scoring system uses multiple batches. So the intention, as much as we're able to, is to have multiple batches that inform a score. Certainly, it's not going to be all the batches that a manufacturer makes, but it shows, even from that question, the potential for both systems to really work very well with each other, where you have a limited number of batches to get you that snapshot of red, yellow, green quality risk scores, again, risk scores, that can help inform you on which green supplier to have a requirement for every batch to be sampled and tested. And we've been doing this with Kaiser for a number of years. And honestly, their biggest question was this going to be operationally possible? And the long story short answer is yes, it is working. It's been working for a few years now in a pilot setting that's now growing substantially. It can be done at full batch level and even full supply level of a manufacturer to not only get that snapshot of information of radiolow green, but then require the ongoing certification as part of these supply contracts. So hopefully that might even answer a few questions.
So next question from Jeffrey Fenton. Any thoughts on the economics of generic and its impact on the fragility of supply chain? The reason there is not more redundancy in the supply chain today and not more US or friendly nation manufacturing is largely economic, is it not?
Yeah, so I can take that. And great question. And I think underscores the point that a lot of the drivers of the challenges in this is really a broken market failure that really force a lot of unnecessary pressure on manufacturers that are dedicated to making high quality medicines that are made in the United States or in Europe or in other parts of the world, to include even Asia, where there are companies that are trying to do the right thing. And so those what ends up leading to some of these quality challenges are economic in nature. I'll give you an example. I spent several hours looking into the medicine supply chain map that US Pharmacopoeia has and their algorithm and all their metrics of measuring and predicting drug shortages. And a couple of the criteria that is looked at is, and this is counterintuitive to a lot of people, because most people that are not in this industry think of the pharmaceutical industry as this one monolithic, that they're all these big billion-dollar companies and they make tons of money, and there's really, they're charging too much for the medicines. But what people need to understand is that bifurcated market where on the generic side, there's a lot of pressures exacerbated by sometimes middleman organizations, whether they're group purchasing organizations, pharmacy benefit manager organizations, that will make a lot of money on margin on the high-end brand name medicines, but at the same time publicly will put downward pressure to the point where they're squeezing down to the pennies per pill on the generic side. And what that does is it creates these untenable, unsustainable market pressures against companies who are trying to do the right thing for quality manufacturing, auditing, all the best practices we realize that are done by high quality generic manufacturers. You add on top of that the over concentration of certain molecules being made by just a few companies, because those companies that would otherwise want to make those molecules are priced out of the market from making them. Why? Because their costs of labor are higher. They have to follow environmental regulatory requirements, as we mentioned before. So yes, I mean, this is really a market failure. And one of the things that's counterintuitive is that there are, and one of the risk areas for a drug shortage is when a drug is priced too low, is one of about 5 or 6 risk factors other than concentration for generic medicine that is predictive of it going on shortage. Is that if the molecule or that pill is priced too low, you can make the argument from an economic standpoint that the market has removed any incentive to build in quality in that drug and that reliability in that drug supply. So I agree. I believe it is largely economic as a driver, Jeffrey.
And maybe one thing to add on to that, I think this is another way to incentivize American manufacturing. That comes up a lot, and it even came up in the hearing that Vic testified at of, should the Defense Department make more medicines? And there are examples where the Defense Department steps in for very specific vaccines or therapeutics that wouldn't otherwise be part of a market and kind of creates its own market. However, we're talking about a multi-trillion-dollar global supply chain that's heavily, for better or worse, structured overseas, largely in India and China. Not to say that they can't make a quality product, but having that visibility is important. And there is a manufacturing base in the United States, although much of it has gone overseas. As Vic pointed out from that anecdote from the White House meeting, is that, and actually it's been in other hearings, that the American manufacturing base is at 50% capacity. So if you have a market fix to better incentivize their ostensibly quality products that they're making, then you don't need billions of dollars of infrastructure investment for the broad market. There might be certain essential medicines that makes sense for, but to have more quality manufacturing, to have more American manufacturing, you can simply have a fixed incentive structure. If you give them an incentive to get business, or give the the purchasers incentive and transparency to that, then hopefully they just ramp up production, and then they're able to sell more of what they already have a capacity built out to make.
Thank you. So next question from James Masterson. He couldn't attend the first part of the meeting. His question is, has the Defense Logistics Agency engaged in placing quality clauses in their contracts used to purchase drugs for the DoD?
Yeah, I mean, I can't answer that directly. I'm no longer in the Defense Department, but I think it's an interesting idea. It's something that before I left active duty, I encouraged the folks at the Defense Logistics Agency where they were, reviewing their solicitation for, a $10 billion 5-year pharmaceutical prime vendor contract to really discuss or at least require some level of quality clauses in their large, contract. I mean, we're talking about $10 billion, $2 billion a year at DLA. I definitely think for DLA to look at this, I think in hand with the Defense Health Agency, and to collectively come up with what makes sense for updating some of those contracts so that the DLA could eventually have something that in. And I'm not talking about maybe for the thousands of medicines that they're procuring. Let's just focus on something that's a priority, which is the 40 or 44 essential medicines that the DoD is going after. So we're talking about 800, maybe 900 national drug codes. It's not the 10,000 that might be in their entire list of acquisition. Over.
Yeah, and I think it really underscores the point that a large institution like the military, like Kaiser, and certainly Kaiser that's actually doing this, is proving that you can affect substantial change within contract with relatively simple changes, right? It's always an exercise to change anything, of course, but by simply requiring an independent certification, by perhaps even just putting a box in procurement, are you independently certified or not, or reviewing and having a best value contract as opposed to just simply lowest price technically acceptable. Could we do some relatively straightforward actions from the contracting standpoint? Really can have a dramatic impact. And I think for the military folks especially, I know it even came up in Vic's hearing, I think it's really important to understand that the military does have tremendous contracting power. It may only be a few percentage points of the overall U.S. market of pharmaceuticals, but so is Kaiser. Kaiser is very similar size to the military, and they are able to have an effect. There may be a lot of concentration of purchasing organizations, but there's a very large diversity of suppliers. And so the DoD's volume as a buyer is absolutely substantial enough that they can demand things in their contracts, demand quality clauses per the question, and obviously encourage them to do that. And there's even some precedents of how to do that with the Kaiser model.
Thank you. So next question from Michael Gaiman. Would independent testing be performed on each manufacturing lot of randomly sampled based on some statistically valid frequency? I'm curious if most of the red drugs are consistently red, or if high batch-to-batch viability causes some to oscillate between red, yellow, green each time they're tested.
Yeah, great question. And I think I maybe answered a little bit of that before on the batch level side. But to get into the statistics, part of the real details of the sausage there with the framework of scoring is that there's different categories of how things get scored depending on the statistical confidence of the limited data. Right. So really just depending on how many batches, there are situations where we can only get one. And there's much more leniency for the data that comes out of that one batch, as opposed to if we can get 4 or more batches and have more statistical confidence in what's being seen. There are many elements of that framework that relate to that question of, do you see this one time, or are you seeing this in every single batch? Seeing a rubric implication score or a metric that will affect the rubric in every single batch has a much more severe implication on the score than seeing it just one time. And it depends on what it is. If it's an extremely high level of an extremely potent carcinogen, for example, that may implicate a red right away. It's already showing that it's a very high risk product, as opposed to perhaps being close to some limit, but not quite at some limit, or showing a certain contaminant much higher than its competitors and showing that consistently is all considered as part of this framework. And we're actually working with some academic collaborators now that to even get at least some of the snapshots of where we are now with that framework into peer review and out in publication. But I appreciate the question, at least to underscore that there are a lot of details that consider exactly those kinds of statistical questions into how to arrive at the simple red, yellow, green.
Thank you. Next question from Ellen Embry. Do we have enough US-based manufacturers that could be licensed to incorporate quality testing along the data points briefed?
Yeah, I can try to take this. As Dave alluded to, and I think I mentioned that, one piece of information we found in a study that API Innovation Center out of St. Louis, Missouri found was that, U.S. pharmaceutical manufacturing is roughly at 50% capacity. That means there's 50% underutilized. Now, you look at other manufacturing sectors and industry, it's around 80% or more is kind of the sweet spot for a healthy manufacturing sector. So we know already that if the pharmaceutical industry is performing 30 points below that, we have a very fragile, very unhealthy industry where I think there's room for growth. And one of the other indicators is how many filed ANDAs do you have relative to active ones, right? That's another kind of measure where you can kind of say, okay, well, how many people left the marketplace and how many people, because even if they left the marketplace, some of these locations will continue to maintain their abbreviated new drug application, but they just won't make that molecule for an economic reason. But that's potentially an indicator that they're willing to do it if the market changes. And one of the things that we would like more people to think and talk about is that if quality can be incentivized, that's one area that domestic and European manufacturers, our allied partner nation manufacturers, have an opportunity to kind of compete and to increase some of that manufacturing that's there. I think the other promising thing that we're seeing right now is also, we see a group out of the St. Louis, Missouri with API Innovation Center. We see another group down there for Association for Accessible Medicines out of the Virginia area, where they're going after making essential medicines, but they're using it or they're using advanced manufacturing technologies, right? And those are technologies that we're typically seeing embraced in the high value chain, innovative brand name markets where they have billion-dollar R&D budgets to invest capital into using this technology that is often cleaner and potentially a means where they could potentially get higher yields without polluting the environment, and using technology to do process analytics in real time, so you can't falsify paper data on production records. And so I think we're starting to see that those are emerging. The federal government is partnering with those private institutions to actually help transition or convert the marketplace to using American innovation and technology with our domestic, and our allied partners to really convert the marketplace to bring back some of that manufacturing here to achieve independent manufacturing. Over.
Thank you. And other question from Ellen: what committees in Congress will be the recipient of the results of the study?
Vic may know more.
No, can you say that again? Can you repeat that question?
What committees in Congress will be the recipient of the results of the study?
Yeah, I believe several of them. It's several committees, but I know that the Origin Committee, from what I found out later, came out of some pending legislation back in 2019, and that came out of the Senate side. So I don't know if it's Senate Armed Services Committee, and which subcommittee, but we already know that the Personnel Subcommittee, at least on the military side, is very, very focused on this. But we know that there was interest on this in 2019 before the pandemic. And what happened was all the momentum to address this issue from a national security standpoint, being over-reliant on API and KSMs from sometimes adversarial nations, was a very hot topic in the fall and winter of 2019. But it came to a crashing halt when COVID hit, and it didn't resurge again until around 2022. So we lost about 2 years in dealing with this issue. So that's what I could say about that. I'm not a political person. So next question.
Thank you. We have two more questions, one from Eric Van Giesen and another one from Jeffrey Fenton. I will ask a question from Eric and then from Jeffrey, because in logical consequence. So question from Eric. Would it be possible to imagine a scenario where KSMS and APIs manufactured by foreign suppliers are required to be manufactured domestically? This continues the analogy to the automobile industry that was proposed earlier.
So I certainly think that there's a scenario that does this. And like the question asked, there's an analogy with the automobile industry. If you look at several years ago, how tariffs were targeted in the automobile industry, specifically for pickup trucks. There was a very high quality, very in-demand pickup truck called the Toyota Tundra. And originally, Toyota wanted to make the Tundra in Japan and then import them in the United States. Well, the previous U.S. trade representative, Bob Lighthizer, basically had negotiated with the previous administration that says, hey, look, if you want to sell those, if you want to import those Toyota Tundras in the United States, we're going to slap a 25% tariff on that. And what Toyota decided to do after that, that tariff threat was they said, okay, we'll partner with you and build a plant in San Antonio. So now for the past several years, they've been building Toyota Tundras, high quality ones, employing American employees with a supply chain that's using the North American, Mexico, Canada agreement. So there's a supply chain mostly in North America, in the United States, in partnership with Canada and Mexico, employing thousands and thousands of Americans with infrastructure, which is really critical here that I remind those that are in the Defense Department. One of the reasons why this country was able to push back Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan in 1945 was we had an industrial base that was converted during wartime to prevent really loss and really authoritarian governments all over the world. So this was an opportunity in the car business to actually have those manufacturers come to the United States. And we welcome, I think, a lot of people in the United States would welcome foreign manufacturers to come to the United States and employ Americans using a supply chain that comes out of the United States, investing in advanced technologies so that you can't falsify records in GMP. And so I do think there's an applicability for KSMs and API manufacturers to come here in the United States, partner with U.S. partners, and make high quality medicines here. Over.
And I think one thing to add on to that and to the few questions about the American manufacturing base that already exists and talking about KSMs, for those that may not be aware, they're key starting materials. So that's kind of the very beginning of making a drug that gets formed into an active pharmaceutical ingredient that then gets formulated into a final dosage form. But that any amount of that chain that is able to be brought to the United States is obviously a universal good thing that we should all be pushing for. And whether it's leveraging the existing manufacturing, incentivizing it through the market, or specific actions by the government. And I think any of those, let's keep in mind, you can focus, right? Focus by picking key drugs that make the most sense. There could be key drugs, and I know the group at the Uniformed Services University has already done a lot of work on the essential medicines list. not only the DoD's 40 drugs that are essential for war-fighting effort and a pre-deployment checklist, but how does that align with the FDA essential medicines list, the World Health Organization list, and various other lists that allow us to really boil down on particular drugs that are very meaningful for everybody, so we don't have to boil the ocean, and we could also be realistic, right? That moving an entire multi-trillion-dollar industry of manufacturing, overnight into the United States is not realistic, right? It may not be optimal for many reasons, but incentivizing some of it and picking key drugs that make so much sense for so many stakeholders to take actions on, I think is so important, and is also important. We didn't get into a lot of conversations of why not to do this. That also comes up, is like, well, if you do too much on quality, might you create shortages or have incentives that are not aligned, or all sorts of concerns that people might raise that might be relevant for the entire pharmaceutical supply chain. But once you pick a few key drugs, I think a lot of also those concerns melt away and can be addressed by picking the right drugs where there's, let's say, a robust market already, that even if we took a few reds and disincentivized them, it's not going to create a shortage. And there's been published reports about that, by the way, published studies looking at things like blood pressure medications that were heavily contaminated, where half the market went away. The price that wasn't affected, the volumes maintained because the green manufacturers made more. And so I think there's a lot that can be done on American manufacturing, on the whole supply chain reshoring or nearshoring, if we pick key drugs to focus on.
Thank you. And last question from Jeffrey Fenton. Compelling presentation. What are the next steps?
Well, I mean, I'll start off and then I'll let Dave kind of complete it. But I think the next steps are, we're really still in the middle of this pilot study, right? This is not something that we are trying to rush through. This is a very deliberate study. This aspect that Dave and I are talking about is one of 6 lines of efforts, right? And so we've got to get through the data. We're doing a lot of work to make sure that the network of the secondary testing provides a level of assurity for performance qualification between labs, and making sure that all those processes are sound, so that we can do that during a pilot study, so that if the Defense Department and other health systems want to further adopt this in a sustainment type of a program, we'll have the mechanics, the lessons learned of how this can be implemented successfully in a health system. So that's kind of where we're at. We're halfway through. We should be wrapping up data on secondary testing very, very soon, before the end of the year for sure. And we're really looking forward to briefing the senior leadership in the DoD on those details as we get into November or December. Dave, next steps?
Yeah, no, I think you underscore a really important point that a lot of, first of all, we're still in the first year. I know people are very excited about the project, and certainly a lot of attention being done to doing it right and doing it in a way that's scalable. There's a lot of innovation around all of this on the structure of how to do it, even the framework. It's nice to publish something in a big journal, which is great, but how does it realistically work when you're getting real data? That framework has been updated by the expert review panel multiple times, and appropriately so, and may need to continue to be updated. And I think another next step that we're already seeing that we very much appreciate, and anyone on this call or listening perhaps afterwards, on collaboration. There's a lot that can be done that's never been able to be done with this kind of transparency. We're seeing a lot of the academic centers, academic health systems, or just broad industry players here, that how can we leverage an NDC-based red, yellow, green system? Could you have better reimbursement models? Not just purchasing that we talked about extensively. Is this something that Medicaid can get more engaged on? Are there other models in government, in private sector, that can leverage this for purely research, for improving outcomes, from improving reimbursement models, purchasing models? And I think we're getting to the point to, as Vic mentioned, here pretty soon, where we're going to have real finalized data on at least a few of the initial drugs, and certainly in the next year a lot more, that we can take real actions with. And so finding more collaborators to help all of us make this a really impactful project that we can fix the broken market incentives and improve outcomes for health systems and patients. We would love to discuss more. So I think that is the big, grand next steps and the overall focus of what we're doing.
Okay, thank you very much again for fantastic presentation and for great discussion. So so we have final replic from Ellen Emberley. So thank you for hosting and sharing this with us. So okay, thank you again. And yeah, I think we have no more questions. Now is already 1:11, and I will close the meeting. Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Right.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thanks.